Good afternoon. This is Inside Look. I'm Neil Mercado. Southeast Asian leaders are gathered in Indonesia for the 42nd Association of Southeast Asian Nations Summit, or ASEAN Summit. At the summit, the leaders tackle issues concerning the region, including economic recovery, trade and commerce, and regional cooperation. But beneath these issues are other issues impacting the Southeast Asian region, including the contested waters in the South China Sea, the brewing battle between the United States and China, and the conflict between China and Taiwan. Where is the Philippines in the middle of these issues? Where is the Marcos administration headed? Joining us today on Inside Look is security expert Dr. Chester Cabalza. Chester, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us again here in the program.
Thank you, Neil, for inviting me, and to the team of Inquirer. Thanks for having me.
Chester, there's so much to talk about, but let's
Right.
first start with the West Philippine Sea issue. Since the last time we talked, there have been multiple reports of Chinese aggression in the West Philippine Sea. Chinese vessels and militia remain in our waters, according to the Philippine Coast Guard. And despite these supposed agreements between President Ferdinand Marcos and Chinese President Xi Jinping, why do these things keep on happening?
Okay, let's look at the evolution and the recent developments lately in the West Philippine Sea. Of course, China is offering an open lines of communications with us.
Mhm.
Of course, that is not new. It's a rehash from the 1997 Coast Guard diplomacy. But during the visit of President Marcos to Beijing in January, this was offered again to us. It means that this should be coming from Beijing. And definitely, we're waiting on the details of these lines of communication. But as we have observed, we saw duplicitous actions coming from China. Although we have high level talks in Beijing, and of course, the foreign minister of China visited Manila, but it seems like on the ground things are happening differently. We've seen
Mhm, mhm.
shadowing by the Chinese Coast Guard, and then the electronic warfare, and of course, the swarming of their vessels. In other words, they are not leaving the West Philippine Sea. So, what can we do about this? Given that, of course, I think the development recently is that we have already placed the Philippine Coast Guard at the forefront. They are now the major actor instead of the Navy and the Marines. I think that's the new development coming from the
Mhm.
Philippines. And then I think the best and effective mechanism for them to address these pressures and bullying coming from China is their transparency and tell all strategy, which we saw in this Marcos administration. There were relevant reports about the skirmishes and bullying tactics coming from the China Coast Guard and the maritime militia. So these are the developments. But I think the major development would be the revival of the Philippines and U.S. Alliance. And
Mhm, mhm.
recently we had the biggest Balikatan exercises
Mhm.
conducted last April. I think this is the latest development, and with the defense partnership on the guidelines, I think these are very relevant. Although they're now telling in that guidelines that in case of attack with our Philippine Coast Guard, the U.S. would also be supporting us. Because in the previous mutual defense treaty and in the visiting forces agreement, it's only the Navy and the Marines that were explicitly written in those agreements. So the Coast Guard is now part of this equation here.
Chester, you mentioned the agreement between the Philippines and China. If I remember it correctly, during
Right.
President Marcos's visit to China, there was this supposed agreement between him and Chinese President Xi Jinping that we're going to have a compromise. But one argument could be
Right.
made that what is there to compromise if
Mm.
the waters are ours? So is this just a matter of China not adhering to the
Mm.
supposed agreement with the Philippines, or there's also a problem with the Philippines' response? Should the Philippines put more pressure on China?
The problem here is now on the information domain or the cognitive warfare, because it seems like we have two versions or two narratives that are prevailing right now, one
Mhm,
coming from China or from Beijing, and one coming from Manila or the Philippines. And in our
mhm,
own narrative, we are telling that those maritime features within the 200 nautical miles are part of the territory of maritime territories of the Philippines, which I think would be part of the maritime entitlements that we won in the Hague ruling in 2016. But it seems like some of the shoals islands within
Chester, we're losing you a bit.
well, of course, we're
Go
trying
ahead.
to see. Well, okay, we're trying to see that there are two narratives now. One is coming from
Mhm,
Beijing and from Manila, but in our case, from the Philippine narrative, we are very consistent with our pronouncements that islands and maritime entitlements within the 200 nautical miles are part of the
mhm,
territories of the Philippines. But it seems like what we are seeing right now on the ground, some of the islands and shoals are occupied by the Chinese. You have the Mischief Reef, and then you have, of course, the Scarborough Shoal and some other reefs that I think are being swarmed in and claimed by China right now. So that's the dilemma right now.
mhm,
How will China will China leave those territories? You know, that's a problem with somewhere there was some debates and jokes. If you listen to the people, we asked the
mhm,
Americans to leave our bases before and they left. But
mhm,
can we do that also with the Chinese? If we
mhm,
ask the Chinese to leave our territories in the West Philippine Sea, would they leave by respecting the maritime rules-based norms? I think that is the continuation of the code of conduct, which was discussed actually in the ASEAN right now, and it's good
mhm,
that Indonesia is hosting this ASEAN forum right now, because Indonesia is like the de facto leader of ASEAN,
mhm,
and also it's the largest archipelago in the world. So I mean, when it comes to maritime security, they have the voice to influence basically what would be the content and subtext and pretext of the provisions should be in the code of conduct that we will be having soon.
mhm.
Hopefully, we will
Chester,
have it.
you mentioned this earlier. I think I actually took note of it. It's a good way to describe it. There are two narratives right now. There's the Philippine narrative, and then
Right,
there's the Beijing narrative. But how do we go beyond that? Because right now, they are just narratives.
right.
So
Stories,
one nation will believe their own narrative, the other nation will believe their own narrative.
definitely.
So the question now is how do we go beyond that? Because you can't have two
Mm.
truths at once.
Right, right. I agree. Especially now in a world where we have reached this post-truth era, or the many truths, depending on how you would tell the narrative. But of course, it goes down to different layers also. One would be for the civilians and for the military. Because, of course, for the military, this would be part of the cognitive warfare. And in the cognitive warfare, that depends on the kind of narrative that we are embracing. And that would also influence the kind of strategy and doctrines that our military will take into consideration, especially that we are modernizing now, and we are also keeping our alliance with the United States. But for the civilians, of course, this is an intergenerational narrative. There is now a proposal that grade 10 um, students should learn the Hague ruling, and also some of the important subjects in our struggles in the West Philippine Sea, because it talks also politics, economics, strategic culture, environment, law, and and foreign relations. So you see the humongous and wide-ranging topics and lessons that we can learn from our struggles and narratives in the West Philippine Sea. So I guess it broadens our perspectives basically on how we look at the issue of the West Philippine Sea.
Chester, you mentioned the ASEAN summit earlier. A couple
Hmm.
of days ago, President Marcos said he will urge ASEAN leaders to finalize the South China Sea Code of Conduct. So we have no update yet on whether the leaders have discussed this issue in detail. But what makes this year's ASEAN summit crucial in terms of
Right.
having conversations and possibly agreeing on a concrete action regarding the South China Sea issue? Because
Hmm.
ASEAN summit is an annual event, but what makes
Right,
this year
right.
crucial?
I think this is very important because the issue on the code of conduct is a long overdue. It has been discussed for over a decade already,
Over a
and I think
decade,
we have
yes.
not reached the completion for the code of conduct. We have a framework that has been passed in, I think, in 2000, but the framework not basically. It just lays down the stories and the complaints of the claimant countries in the South China Sea. But when it comes to actions, because of course once you have laws you have to implement it. I think that is also the vision of the Southeast Asian countries, where we will see the seek for enforcement. And I think that is also a problem for many maritime countries, especially for Southeast Asian countries. But at the same time, we have a white elephant in the room, which is China, because China is also a claimant country in the region, in the South China Sea. And China is the most powerful country in Asia and also in Southeast Asia. So basically, they have a say also to the wordings and provisions of the code of conduct. And I think, given our experiences with them, I think those should transpire also in the provisions. And I think the reason why I told that it's important because it's Indonesia that is hosting it. Remember that in the past, the reason why it was not pushed forward because the host countries for ASEAN summit were countries that are aligned with China, like say
Aligned
for
with
example,
China.
Cambodia, Myanmar, and so on, or in the Indo-China region. But definitely, I mean Indonesia has a bigger voice right now. It is a de facto leader of the region, and it's also the a maritime and archipelagic country. So, in other words, they know our sentiments, they know our complaints, but hopefully they're trying to be, and of course Indonesia is a big middle power in the region, so as much as
I
possible they're
agree.
trying to become a broker when it comes to some problems, maritime issues and threats in the region, because of course that would give more prominence to Indonesia if in case they would succeed in advancing the code of conduct in the region.
So Chester, let's talk about Indonesia and maybe the ASEAN
Right.
region at large. It's important that we also take note that the issue of South China Sea does not just concern the Philippines, right? Based on my
Agree.
research, Chester, please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam, they also have claims in the South China Sea. So this is not just a matter of the Philippines seeking support from neighboring countries. Because
Right.
aside from China, countries in the ASEAN region also have to fix the overlapping claims among them.
Right, I agree with you. That's the reason why the 11 countries in the ASEAN are doing a hedging strategy, meaning to say that they are performing a balancing act with the United States and China. And if you try to look at the recent publication of the Lowy Institute in Australia, it seems like only the Philippines and Singapore that are aligning with the United States, meaning to say that other countries in Southeast Asia are hedging with China because of its economic support and prowess in the region, meaning to say that they need China basically. So it only takes time. When will the Philippines would welcome also Chinese benevolent economic support for the Philippines? We I heard that China is also doing a joint military exercises with Singapore and Indonesia, so that would change the equation in the future. So in other words, we are at the crucial point right now. Even if let's say that the Philippines is a maritime and archipelagic country, for me it's still an archipelagic country. It's not yet a maritime power because we have not yet arrived where we have all the indicators for to become a maritime power. For me, Indonesia and Vietnam are far better to become a maritime power. They have voices when it comes to this, meaning to say that they can eject and reject China's offers because of their strong military. Right now, we are engaging with the alliance with the United States because of the handicap that we are experiencing in our military modernization. Let's wait until the third horizon would be completed, and we'll see if we have at least a maximum defense posture that we can claim that we are already a maritime power. So you see, there are a lot of dynamics happening here, and we are saying also that the Philippines is an important actor in the region. Let's not
Because we
dismiss that.
can
Yeah,
we can talk about the geographical location of
right,
Philippines
right,
alone, especially in the context of the China and U.S. Cold War, if we may call it that.
right,
It's
right.
the location of the Philippines is very important, but that's for another conversation that we
Mm,
might have in the future. But we've been pushing for a South China Sea Code of Conduct between ASEAN and China for decades now. This is not new, Chester, but
right,
is this
right.
enough? Because frankly speaking, a code of
Mm,
conduct might as well just be a piece of paper if China will
mm.
not acknowledge it.
Or China will dominate it in terms of the wordings. I think the code of conduct, although it's a piece of legislation coming from the ASEAN claimant countries and coming from China, but
Mm-hmm.
we'll see how this will be dictated in terms of the wordings, because the language would be very important there.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess Beijing will have an upper hand in the composition of the language, in the
Mm-hmm.
provisions of the law, because basically it talks about how we will conduct the operations when it comes to freedom of navigation and overflight, and in case of skirmishes, and definitely the lines of communications will be opened up also. So there are a lot of things that will be discussed, but I guess our experiences in the wider South China Sea, and specifically in the West Philippine Sea, will give us more room to at least review some of the provisions that will be dictated during the plenary when it comes to this code of conduct. But
Mm-hmm.
the question there is, how much time do we have, because
Mm-hmm.
we've been discussing this for over a decade already, and we see a different dynamics now. Before, there was no heightened power competition between China and the United States, but now we are seeing a heightened power rivalry between the United States and China, and some of the countries in Southeast Asia now are becoming middle powers. Plus, you have also another problem in the Taiwan Strait, which is basically connected also to the West Philippine Sea
Mm-hmm.
or to the South China Sea. You cannot get rid of that equation, the Taiwan Strait with the South China Sea, because in case of skirmishes in the South China Sea, or let's say in the Taiwan Strait, these are all interconnected. The waterways are all interconnected. That's the reason why, if you could remember, in the recent biggest Balikatan exercises that the Philippines and the United States conducted, they have EDCA sites in the northern and also in the West Philippine Sea. You see the connection of these waterways. So
Mm-hmm.
the threat has become more expansive,
Mm-hmm.
wider, and quite dangerous right now. It's a different scenario that we are seeing right now, and also the warfare scenario would be different, because you have now electronic warfare, cognitive warfare. It's
Mm-hmm.
not the traditional land, air, water. And you
Mm-hmm.
also have, that's the reason why in the defense agreement that we have recently with the United States, they have included the two other domains. You have cyber and space. So all of the five war domains are actually will be witnessed in case there will be shooting wars or skirmishes or conflicts in the
Mm-hmm.
West Philippine Sea or South China Sea.
Mhm. So the ASEAN summit should really be a good opportunity for ASEAN leaders to really come up with a, maybe we can say, united stand, I guess, with regard to this, to
Could
the
be.
South China Sea Code of Conduct. So you're watching Inside Look. We'll just take a quick break. We'll have more discussions with security expert Dr. Chester Cabalza when we return. Please stay with us.
This map of the Philippines has gone viral. But what's so special about it? Through this map, you can find out what travel level you are in based on the provinces you have already been to.
My name is Lenz Del Villar, and I'm a software engineer. I'm based in Singapore, so I'm in Singapore right now. And I was the one who created the My Philippines Travel Level Map app. Yung inspiration nito is I saw the Japanese travel map version. Some I think web developer also did it. I saw this back in way like 2019. And back then, I just finished living and working in Japan. Kind of had a lot of travels in Japan, and I tried the Japanese map, and it was so cool. And I thought, oh, baka pwede gawin din to sa Philippines. So, yung Philippines Travel Level app, it will show you a map of the Philippines divided into the 83 provinces, which includes Metro Manila. And all you have to do is to tap on each province and choose the level of travel that you have experienced there. So, merong iba-ibang levels. Yung highest level is yung live there, if tumira ka doon. And then yung lowest score, yung 0, is you have never been there. And it's an indicator na you have to experience going there.
Despite being a software engineer, Dance did not have any background in web development. In building the map, he had a special kind of teacher. AI.
I was on a layover. I was going to Turkey for a holiday. And then, parang naisipan ko na, why don't I use ChatGPT to help me create this app, to help me learn web development, and at the same time, create this Philippines version of the travel map. So, meron kaming mga long bus trips na sobrang boring. So, ginagawa ko, nagko-code ako sa loob ng bus, ganun. Tapos, tinetest ko, ganun. So, ayun, sinimulan ko siya. And then, I put up the site. And then, I shared it on my Instagram stories. And then, my friends quickly picked it up. And then, I also shared it on Reddit. And then, the fellow Redditors found it cool. And then, they shared it on their own social media sites. Until ayon, sumabog na siya. Na-pick up na ni McCoy Dubs, ni DP Lenny, and then, ayun, naging viral.
Being a travel junkie himself is one of Dance's inspirations in building his DIY map.
So I think as a millennial, nasa DNA yata ang wanderlust sa amin. Although, sadly, mababa yung level ko sa Philippines travel level. I'm only on 62. And I think it's because soon after university, naging OFW na ako. For me naman, I think it's a wake-up call na kailangan ko pa talagang bisitahin ang maraming lugar sa Philippines. I try to look at all the other people's posts about the app, like the stories that they share, like why they have traveled that at that level, or why they haven't traveled at that level. So I'm looking at a lot of them, and I appreciate the stories behind them.
You're watching Inside Look. Joining me today is a security expert, Dr. Chester Cabalza. Chester, let's talk about President Marcos' visit to the United States. What did his visit to the U.S. tell you?
Okay, I think this is very important because we are reviving our ties with the United States. Although it's not the highest visit so far, because the one we had with Beijing is the state visit, and I think Marcos Jr. will still have to do a state visit to the United States. But given that he has already been to the United States twice, first during his UNGA speech in September, I think that laid the ground in our relations with the United States. Washington is very happy about that. And we were thinking that Marcos Jr. would do a balancing act between China and the United States. It seems like it paved the way for more bilateral relationship with Washington. I think we have a robust relationship now with the Oval and with the White House. So I guess and also the most important would be laying down some of the most important programs for the government, because I guess it's not only about the defense and security that should be tackled here, but the most important, which we are seeing on the ground and also in the region, would be the economic warfare between the US and China. We are talking about the number one and number two world's economies. So this is a win-win for the Philippines if we could nurture it well for our own advantage.
So, Chester, during that visit of President Marcos to the U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said the U.S. has the Philippines back on the issue of the West Philippine Sea. We also have the 4 new EDCA sites here in the country, which is a project between the U.S., a partnership between the U.S. and the Philippines. You also mentioned earlier the Balikatan exercises that we recently held. So, is this indicative of where the Marcos administration's foreign policy is headed, and what may be the impact of this to our relationship with China? Because as you know, the previous administration really put a lot of importance in our relationship with China. So does it say anything about our relationship with China?
Okay, I'll answer that in two parts. One,
Mm-hmm.
the importance of the American comeback in the Philippines, because of
Mm-hmm.
course certainly they've been waiting for this opportunity because for the past 6 years they were deprived to show off what kind of robust relationship they could offer to Manila, and we saw that we also pivoted to Beijing at the time. This time around, I think more than anything, it's Washington that is trying to lure us and trying to show to us that they are a competent and appropriate partner when it comes to what is happening now in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that's the reason why they are very aggressive lately, and they are trying to change some of their narratives from defense and security to economic partnerships. Because of course,
Mm-hmm.
we have another major actor in of course no in our backyard, and that is China. Now, the direction of Marcos Jr.'s foreign
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
policy, I think we are trying to rewrite right now what has been written in the past 6 years, but still we are geared towards that independent foreign policy. I think this is the best way of simplifying the term of independent foreign policy, because we
Mm-hmm.
are not siding on one side. It just so happened that Washington was able to articulate well what they wanted for the Philippines, and we have common national interests and common national threats. That's the reason why Marcos Jr. is engaging with Washington, with President Biden, and um, the foreign policy is geared towards to Washington's favor right now. But we're not closing our doors to Beijing. That doesn't mean
Mm-hmm.
that the mere
That's
fact
a.
we are talking to Washington, we are
Mm-hmm.
closing our doors already to Beijing. That's not what we're getting from the actions of
Mm-hmm.
Marcos Jr. here. I think he still has a bigger plate for China in terms
Mm-hmm.
of their economic and security relations. I think because our bilateral relationship with China, and
Chester, we are losing you a
yeah,
bit, but
yeah.
that's actually a very interesting take that you have there. You think that the Marcos administration is still not closing its doors
Mm,
to Beijing, despite the recent statements made not just by the Beijing government but also by the Philippine government. And these statements
mm.
regarding the West Philippine Sea following the aggressions, they are strongly worded.
Right, right. Despite those strongly worded pronouncements coming from Beijing, I know
Mm-hmm.
China cannot afford to lose the Philippines because of our
Mm-hmm.
geographic importance, and secondly, because they really would want to address the many insecurities that they have with the Philippines. One is we still have the Hague ruling in on our favor,
Mm-hmm.
and for China to become a superpower, it has to stabilize that narrative that we are friends with the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
Because if the Philippines becomes their enemy with that kind of ruling, their legitimacy as a superpower will be in question. So as much as that's why if you look at the patterns right now, um, whenever our president goes to Washington, Chinese higher officials come to Manila. And then if our president goes to Beijing, American higher officials come to Manila. So they come back and forth one at a time, by reacting to what we are discussing with these two major powers. So in other words, they need us. We are important. And let's play that game. But of course, it has consequences also. It's a quite dangerous act for President Marcos, but it seems like, based from my reading right now on his actuations and his foreign policy, we are on the right track so far when it comes
Mm-hmm.
to our foreign policy. And I think this is the full pronouncement of what we are dreaming of, the independent foreign policy.
Mhm. Because we're not just talking on the geopolitical context, we're also talking about like, the economic
Right,
context and
right. It should
so
be
on.
holistic. all the dimensions of the how would I say it, the dimensions of power should be balanced. We're not just talking about the defense and security here. Other important dimensions would be economics, people to people, and the military. So these are all important, basically.
Chester, I want to briefly talk about the China-Taiwan conflict.
Mm.
So, on the surface, it seems like it shouldn't concern the Philippines. But my question for you is, why should Filipinos look and monitor the developments in this issue?
Okay, that is a very good question and scenario that you are giving to us. We have to remember that prior to this heightened China-US power rivalry, we have already overseas Filipino workers there. And the Taiwanese people rely so much with our OFWs. They know our strengths, and we've been contributing to the Taiwanese economy. um, Aside from that, Taiwan is also a powerhouse when it comes to microchips, because now the new oil in the world's economy is about the chips. So in other words, that's very important, and also the arms race between the U.S. and China, because Taiwan is also a powerful um, um, country when it comes to military power, spending to protect their own island territory. But of course, that's the interest of the Philippines. But aside from that, we also have a one China policy, and we've been very consistent with that even up to now with the current administration. But it just so happened that um, the power competition between China and the United States is so pronounced and getting tighter, and we are dwarfed by these two superpowers in our own backyard and in the region. And we have noticed that during the last visit of House Speaker Pelosi in Taiwan, where we've seen the fourth biggest trouble of Taiwan and China. And there are three schools of thought. Some would say that China will not invade Taiwan for the reasons that Taiwan houses the 2,000 years old history of Taiwan, because of that because of the artifacts that of course their leader brought into uh, to Taiwan, to Taipei during the Civil War, and up to now you still have the Civil War between Beijing and Taipei here. And some were saying that it could be possible that there would be a forcible retake of Taiwan because of the rejuvenation policy of Taiwan, and the most important territory for China right now would be Taiwan. And because of that rejuvenation policy, there would be a possibility that there would be a retake. And thirdly, some would say that there might be an external force coming from a miscalculation, because basically our leaders are humans. They can create mistakes, and we've seen that in the Russia-Ukraine war. The Western European countries were very relaxed by saying that Putin will not invade Ukraine, until one day they woke up and then Putin invaded Ukraine. That might happen also if, in case, Xi Jinping will one day wake up and he thinks that it's time to invade Taiwan. So we'll never know, and war cannot be predicted. That's the reason why we are preparing for some contingency measures. No,
That's a very
so
interesting observation you have there,
mm,
because I recently watched this documentary about Taiwan's microchip industry, which
right,
is often overlooked, because in this world we're moving towards a digital and technological world. That industry plays a very huge role, and Taiwan has a huge hold in that industry right now. So being losing
right,
Taiwan
right.
is
And
actually
we've seen that
very.
in the trade war between the US and China. That started everything. That's the reason why, especially that China's economy is accelerating to a higher end economy, matured economy. That means that they would be producing more chips and so on. During conflicts and wars, you would see countries steal technology from each other. That's the reason why the U.S. and the Western countries recently, they halted the China to copy or steal some of their technology. That's the reason
Mhm.
why
So,
China now is trying to create their own technology when it comes to chips. So, and of course, no, Taiwan is also an equation for that matter.
so in having these conversations about China-Taiwan conflict, it's not just about a matter of the geopolitical narrative.
Mm.
It's also delves on the economic aspect of things. But also, I don't know if you will agree with me, Chester, but
Mm.
there's also the optics that
Right.
matter here, because if China succeeds in this conflict with
Mm.
Taiwan, there's this narrative of China really being a superpower country. So
Mm.
which could impact the Philippines in its battle in the West Philippine Sea. So my question for you, Chester,
Okay.
is will the China-Taiwan conflict have an impact on the
Very good
Philippines'
question
battle
there.
in the West
You
Philippine Sea?
know, yes. China is now the biggest military in the world. They are dominating the Navy, Air Force, and of course the Army. And because they have invested so much that. And recently, during the time of President Duterte, when he asked President Xi about the state of the West Philippine Sea, what was the response coming from President Xi? If that's the case, then we will prepare for war. And up to now, the Eastern Theater Command is preparing for that eventuality. So they are prepared. But the problem here right now, which we will see whenever if ever there would be a conflict or a world war, is that China doesn't have a world war experience yet. It used to be um, a supporter of the United States and Russia at the time during the Second World War, and it doesn't have a combat and naval experience. That's the problem. Even if you have sophisticated, we've seen that in the Vietnam War. Even if they have the U.S. at the time had sophisticated technology, military technology, they didn't war because it dwells on the guerrilla warfare. That's the reason why they need the Philippines because of our recent experience in the Marawi. We're very good at urban warfare, in hybrid warfare. So and also there was a time during the Korean War we killed a lot of Chinese, and FDR was the head at the time. He was just a lieutenant at the time, and you see how strong Filipino soldiers are. It's like 1 versus 100. So, in other words, that's still the scenario that we are seeing. But we can also not discount the fact that maybe through their doctrines, it would be really a harsher war in case there would be a war in our region soon. And that's the reason
So,
why I was I'm from Cagayan. I was in Cagayan recently, and I visited the two EDCA sites. And I've learned from my fellow Cagayanos and from politicians that the reason why they are afraid that Cagayan would be one of the hosts, because we are hosting two EDCA sites there, would be, aside from the socioeconomic problem that should be addressed by the Americans, is also the possibility that Cagayan can be the battleground for any
because of the because
because of
U.S.
we host
is
the
involved in this.
right. So and the people are so afraid of that kind of scenario, and even the governor himself. But of course, that's the reason why we're trying to fortify. But I guess it's the issue of the competition of doctrines, because you are it's not about the magnanimous technology that you have, but it's about leadership and the strategy that you will use once you get involved to war.
It's a good point that you brought that up,
Mm,
Chester, because it brings me to my last question.
mm.
So, should the Taiwan-China conflict escalate? Should the Philippines be involved? Because monitoring it is one thing. Being
Yeah.
directly involved, should the conflict escalate, is another. So, you mentioned there are concerns that the EDCA
Mm.
sites might be used to aid U.S. and
Okay.
to an extent, Taiwan, should the Taiwan-China situation escalate, but should the Philippines be involved? Granted that President Marcos has said that he will not allow the EDCA sites to be used for the Taiwan-China conflict, but what's your take on that?
Okay, I have a complex answer for that. For the reason that the question is also complex. One is first, the Philippines have no choice because we're not a rich country. Whether or not we side with the Americans or with the Chinese, still because of our geographic location and because we are betting with the Americans right now because of being the host of EDCA
Mm-hmm.
China would definitely would try to attack us. That is a possibility, and also because of the location of the of northern Philippines in the first island chain. Some were saying that the Chinese are already in control of the first island chain. You have Taiwan, northern Philippines, and Japan there. That's the reason why Japan is trying to effectuate that trilateral relationship with Washington and Manila because of that possibility. I think in case there would be war, aside from the OFWs, we have also Taiwanese people, refugees who will be coming to northern Philippines, or either they will go to Japan. That's the only options they have so far. So in any eventuality, we have to prepare the country for humanitarian support. Will the U.S. Help us? Definitely. The only I'm this is sad to say, the only way for China to snatch the position from the United States to become a superpower is through war. That's the only scenario that we are seeing. Even if they would win in this,
But does the Philippines have anything to gain from that?
you know, the alliance, the respect, and the narratives in world history. I think those are far enough that we could gain from that. But definitely, we will we there our soldiers, sailors, and pilots should be prepared for any eventuality. That's the reason why we are modernizing right now, and also our coast guardians. And secondly, we are expanding our alliance. The U.S. is not a
So,
resident. The U.S. is not a resident power in the region. It's China that is the resident power. In other words, from a tactical strategic perspective, China has more advantages over the US right now. That's the reason why China wants to expand its alliances. It's going to be more proxy war coming from the US. But we'll never know.
kumbaga, Chester, sasabi natin sa basketball, home court
Home
advantage, no?
court ng
But
ano,
that's
home
the
court ng
but
China.
that's the exact same reason na that the US is expanding its
Mm.
alliances to the Asia Pacific region to
In a
have
way,
to minimize that advantage of China.
that's the pointer. That's the reason why, from a realist perspective, which I think I would like to cite it also, just to give a better perspective of what may happen in the future, is that um, in any eventuality, whether or not we will choose China or the US, we will be bombed, and we will be involved in this kind of shooting war. And secondly, war is the only way on whether or not the US will still maintain its power in the region, or China would replace the United States as the next superpower. Even if both countries are pronouncing that they don't want war, us, all of the nations around the world don't want war. But the world international system is anarchic. Chances are there would be skirmishes, wars, and conflicts. That's the reason why diplomacy should work. And I think that is the edge of the Philippines as a middle power now, on how to halt and prevent any eventuality coming from this heightened power rivalry between the US and China. If the Philippines will succeed as a middle power in mitigating and becoming a broker, a peace broker for these two countries, then that's good. It's a win-win solution for all of us. And actually, I'm writing a book right now. It's called The New Middle Powers in Southeast Asia, trying to leverage the role of the Philippines and other middle powers in Southeast Asia,
Very interesting.
against the backdrop of this heightened power rivalry of the United States and China in our region.
So Chester, to sum up this interview and wrap this up, I would like to go back to my first question on the Taiwan-China issue. So why should Filipinos monitor and the developments in the Taiwan-China issue? Direct impact on the OFWs, because these are Filipinos staying in Taiwan. Indirect impact would be optics, power play, which might play an important role in the West Philippine Sea narrative. Did I get it correctly?
Right, right. I agree with you there. Yes.
On that note, thank you so much, Chester. We appreciate giving us your time. We'd love to have you back on the show someday.
Thank you, Neil, and to all the team of Inquirer.
That has been your Inside Look, our nightly newscast. Inquirer Today airs live on weekdays, 5 p.m. on INQUIRER.net's online channels. Follow INQUIRER.net on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, and Reddit. For more stories, visit INQUIRER.net. Good afternoon.